She thought the darkness of the mine would swallow her whole. Instead, it handed her back everything she had forgotten she was. At 61 years old, cast aside by the man she had devoted 28 years of her life to, stripped of the home she had filled with warmth and care, Cecelia was left with nothing but a condemned mining structure on a forgotten stretch of land that everyone, including the county assessor, had written off as a liability. What Raymond didn't know, what Cecelia herself was only beginning to suspect, was that when you take everything from a woman who has spent decades giving everything she had, you don't break her. You remove the last thing that was weighing her down. 6 months later, when the world found its way back to that forgotten hillside, they didn't find a woman waiting for the end. They found something carved out of darkness and stone that would leave everyone who had underestimated her unable to speak. This is Cecilia's story, proof that being discarded is not the same as being destroyed. That 61 is not the closing of a chapter but the violent, beautiful beginning of one, and that the most breathtaking transformations happen in the places where no one thinks to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to the property took 40 minutes from the lawyer's office, and Cecelia made it in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of the engine and the particular kind of quiet that only exists after a life has been formally divided into two unequal halves and handed to the wrong people. She had sat in that office 2 weeks ago and watched Raymond's attorney slide a document across the table with the careful, rehearsed expression of a man paid to make injustice feel procedural. The house, the one she had chosen, the one she had painted and replanted and rearranged through 4 different decades, went to Raymond. The savings account she had managed with the discipline of someone who understood that security was something you built slowly and protected fiercely, went to Raymond. The furniture, the car, the life that had accumulated like sediment over 28 years, all of it returned to a man who had decided, at 63, that he deserved something newer. What Cecelia received was a parcel of land in the hill country, outside of a small town called Delridge, 40 minutes from anywhere that mattered. On that parcel sat the entrance to an old silver mine, decommissioned in the 1970s, along with a small equipment shelter that the county had flagged twice for structural violations. Raymond's attorney had presented this with the tone of a man offering a generous consolation. The land was technically hers outright, he explained. No liens, no mortgage. She was lucky, really, when you thought about it. She had not thought about it, not then. Now she sat in her car at the edge of a gravel turnoff and stared through the windshield at what was supposed to constitute her future. The hill rose in front of her, pale and dry, covered in scrub brush and loose shale. A rusted fence ran along the perimeter, posted with faded warning signs. The equipment shelter sat just inside the fence line, a low rectangular structure with a corrugated metal roof that had buckled in at least 2 places. Beyond it, half hidden by overgrown cedar, the mine entrance was sealed with heavy timber boards, most of them warped and grayed with age. Cecelia was 61 years old. She had a college education she had deferred the moment Raymond suggested it made more practical sense for her to support his career while he finished his graduate degree. She had 28 years of experience running a household with the precision and creativity of someone who could stretch a dollar until it apologized. She had a body that had started to register every cold morning in her knees and both hands, and she had at this exact moment $614 in a checking account, 2 suitcases in the back seat, and no plan that extended beyond the next 4 hours. She got out of the car because sitting in it felt worse. The October air carried the smell of cedar and dry earth, and something metallic underneath, faint and mineral, rising from the hillside itself. She walked to the shelter and tested the door. It opened with resistance, dragging against the concrete pad beneath it. Inside, rusted equipment she couldn't name, shelving that had partially collapsed, a layer of grime on every surface, and a single bare bulb hanging from a wire that was connected to nothing. Cecelia stood in the doorway and felt the full weight of where 28 years had brought her. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just stood there while the wind moved through the cedar behind her, and the mine sat sealed in the hillside ahead, and the last light of the afternoon fell across a piece of land that the entire world had agreed was worth nothing. She was starting to understand exactly how that felt. That first night, Cecelia slept in her car. She told herself it was a practical decision. The shelter needed to be assessed in daylight. The floor might not be safe. The roof had buckled, and she didn't know what that meant structurally, didn't know if the whole thing could come down in the night, didn't know enough about any of it to make an informed choice. These were reasonable thoughts. She held on to them the way you hold on to anything that keeps you from acknowledging what is actually happening, which was that she was 61 years old, alone on a hillside in the dark, and she was afraid to go inside the only thing she owned. She reclined the seat as far as it would go and pulled her coat over her shoulders and stared at the ceiling of the car while the temperature dropped outside and the cedar trees made sounds in the wind that she didn't have names for. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was the shallow, unrestored kind of sleep that leaves you more tired than before, full of half-formed images that weren't quite dreams. Raymond at the kitchen table, not looking up. Her children's voices on the phone, measured and careful, already practicing the particular neutrality of people who have chosen a side and need you not to make it difficult. The lawyer's pen scratching across paper, the sound a life makes when it is being formally concluded. She woke before dawn with a stiff neck and the immediate, unambiguous knowledge of exactly where she was and exactly how she had gotten there. There was a mercy in that, she supposed. No disorientation, no moment of forgetting, just the clear, hard fact of it, present and waiting like something that had been sitting in the room all night. She spent the first full day doing what she later came to think of as damage inventory. She moved through the shelter methodically, the way she had always approached problems, cataloging before deciding, understanding before acting. The roof had buckled along the eastern seam, but the main supports were still upright. The floor was solid concrete beneath the grime. The shelving along the north wall was salvageable if she could source the right hardware. There was a workbench along the back wall that was bolted directly into the concrete and hadn't moved in decades. The single electrical line was dead, but the conduit was intact. She found a sleeping bag in the back of her car that she had packed without knowing why, some instinct operating below the level of conscious thought, and she laid it out on the workbench that night because the floor was too cold. She ate crackers and a tin of sardines by the light of her phone and listened to the mine breathe. That was the only word for it. There was a sound that came from behind the boarded entrance, low and slow and rhythmic, the mountain exhaling through the sealed timber, and it filled the shelter in a way that was not quite frightening, but was not quite comforting either. It was simply present, ancient and indifferent and utterly unimpressed by her situation. By the end of the first week, the reality of her circumstances had stopped feeling like a crisis and started feeling like a condition, permanent weather, something to be lived in rather than escaped from. She had $614, which became $438 after she drove into Delridge for supplies. She had a shelter that was cold and dark and smelled of rust and old machinery. She had 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of kitchen items she had packed in the 10 minutes Raymond gave her before he changed the locks, and a body that registered every morning in her joints like a slow-moving complaint. She had no job. She had not worked outside the home in 24 years, and the skills she possessed, the ones that had kept a household running with grace and efficiency for nearly 3 decades, were not the kind that appeared on resumes. She had no references. She had no network in Delridge or anywhere near it. She had a phone with a cracked screen and a data plan that would expire in 3 weeks. Her children called once that first week. Her daughter's voice was careful and kind in the specific way that means someone has rehearsed what they are going to say. She asked if Cecelia was settling in. Cecelia said yes. Her daughter said that was good, that she was glad, that they would talk again soon. They had not talked again soon. Some nights, lying on the workbench in the dark with the mine breathing on the other side of the wall, Cecelia let herself feel the full dimensions of it. The loneliness was not abstract. It had weight and texture and a specific temperature. It sat on her chest, and it was not something she could reason her way out of or reframe into something more manageable. It was simply the truth of her life at that moment, laid out bare and undecorated. She was 61 years old. She was alone. She was starting from nothing in a place that offered nothing, and absolutely no one was coming to help. That was the bottom. She needed to know exactly where it was before she could decide what to do about it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was the mine that changed things. Not in any dramatic or cinematic way, not with a sudden revelation or a flood of light breaking through sealed timbers. It changed things the way most real things change. Quietly, almost accidentally, on an ordinary morning when Cecelia wasn't looking for anything except a reason to keep moving. She had been awake since before dawn, which had become her habit by the second week. Sleep arrived early and left early, and there was nothing to be done about it. She dressed in the cold and stepped outside and stood on the hillside while the sky went through its slow negotiation between dark and light, the cedar trees becoming visible one by one, as though the morning were assembling them from scratch. She had started doing this not out of any appreciation for the scenery, but simply because standing outside felt marginally better than lying in the dark waiting for the day to officially begin. That morning she walked further than usual, past the fence line on the eastern side, along the base of the hill where the shale gave way to a different kind of stone, darker and denser, threaded through with lines of color she hadn't noticed before. She crouched down and looked more closely. Running through the gray rock face were thin veins of deep reddish-brown, almost copper in color, and alongside them something pale and almost luminescent, a mineral deposit she had no name for, catching the early light in a way that seemed to generate its own quiet glow. Cecelia pressed her palm flat against the rock. It was cold and slightly damp, sweating with the overnight temperature drop. She could feel the texture of it against her arthritic fingers, rough and layered, each stratum representing time she could not fathom. Decades, centuries, something so far beyond her own situation that her situation, for just a moment, felt appropriately small. She thought about the mine on the other side of the hill, about what it meant that people had come here once, had looked at this same stone and understood something inside it was worth pursuing, had built an operation around that belief, had pulled something valuable from what looked, to an untrained eye, like nothing more than rock. She stood up slowly, knees protesting, and looked back at the shelter. From this angle, in this light, it looked less like a ruin and more like a beginning. She recognized that this might be a trick her mind was playing on her, the desperate optimism of a woman with no other available options. But she also recognized that it didn't matter. The question was not whether the thought was earned, the question was whether she was going to act on it. She spent that afternoon pulling boards away from the mine entrance. Not all of them. She wasn't foolish enough to walk into an unsecured shaft alone with no equipment and no one who knew where she was, but enough to open a gap, enough to let light in and let air move. She worked for 3 hours with a pry bar she found hanging on the shelter wall, her hands aching and her shoulders burning, until the gap was wide enough to stand in. The air that came out was extraordinary, cool and mineral and ancient, carrying the particular smell of deep earth, something between stone and water and the inside of a clock. It was nothing like the thin, dry air on the hillside. It was dense and alive in a way she felt in her lungs rather than just her nose. She stood at the entrance and let her eyes adjust. The shaft ran straight for about 30 feet before the available light gave out entirely. The walls were timber reinforced, the old supports still standing, and along the left wall someone had long ago embedded iron hooks for lanterns. The floor was flat and clear, packed earth and gravel, swept almost clean by decades of air moving through, and on the walls themselves, where the ore had been pulled away, the stone that remained was breathtaking, layered in bands of silver and gray, and that deep reddish copper, threaded through with white quartz that glittered in the thin light like something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time to be seen again. Cecelia stood at the mouth of that mine and felt something she had not felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not hope, not yet. Something quieter and more foundational than either of those. A sense that the ground beneath her feet was real, that she was standing on something solid, that the earth did not care about Raymond, or about the lawyer's pen, or about the children who were practicing their neutrality from a careful distance. The earth had been here before all of them, and would be here long after, and it was, in its way, completely indifferent to the story she had been telling herself about who she was and what she had lost. That was the first spark, small and uncertain but present, and in the cold and the quiet of that hillside, present was enough. The storm arrived on a Tuesday in late November, with no particular warning beyond a shift in the air pressure that Cecelia felt in her hands before she saw it in the sky. By mid-morning, the clouds had moved in low and fast from the northwest, the kind that don't negotiate, and by early afternoon the rain had started. Not gradually, all at once, like a decision that had already been made somewhere far away and was only now being delivered. She had spent the previous 2 weeks reinforcing the shelter. She had patched the buckled seam in the roof with metal sheeting salvaged from a collapsed section of the old mine fencing. She had sealed the gaps along the base of the walls with a mixture of clay soil and dry grass that she had read about in a homesteading article on her phone during one of the rare moments she had signal. She had felt, cautiously and without announcing it even to herself, that she was getting ahead of things, that she was building something resembling competence out of the raw material of necessity. The storm dismantled that feeling methodically and without mercy. By nightfall, the rain was coming through the roof in 3 places she hadn't identified, and 2 she thought she had fixed. The clay and grass mixture along the base of the eastern wall dissolved back into mud within the first hour, and water began moving across the concrete floor in a thin, steady sheet that found every low point and pooled there with quiet determination. She moved her sleeping bag to the workbench. She positioned every container she owned to catch the drips from the ceiling. She worked in the beam of her headlamp, moving fast, trying to stay ahead of it. She could not stay ahead of it. By the second day, the temperature had dropped sharply, and the rain had developed a texture that wasn't quite sleet, but was working toward it. The shelter was wet in a way that had stopped being a condition of the storm and started being a condition of the structure itself. Everything she owned was damp. Her sleeping bag had lost whatever insulating properties it once had. She wore every layer of clothing she had brought and was still cold in a way that went past physical discomfort into something more systemic, a cold that took up residence in her bones and made decisions there. Her right knee, which had been unreliable since a fall years ago that she had never properly addressed, swelled to the point where bending it became a negotiation. She moved around the shelter in a careful, hitching gait, trying to keep her weight distributed, trying not to acknowledge that if something went seriously wrong, she was 40 minutes from Delridge, and her phone had 4% battery, and the charger was in the car, which was 30 feet away in weather that had stopped caring about the distinction between outside and in. The second night was the hardest thing she had ever endured. She lay on the workbench with the rain drumming the metal roof so loudly that she felt it in her chest, in the spaces between her ribs. And she looked at the ceiling and she let herself think the thought she had been keeping at arm's length since she arrived, that this was not going to work, that whatever stubborn, half-formed idea she had been nurturing about turning this place into something livable, something meaningful, something that proved she was more than what Raymond's attorney had assessed her to be, that idea was the invention of a desperate woman who had confused defiance with capability. She was 61 years old. Her knee was swollen and her hands were stiff, and she was lying on a workbench in a flooded equipment shelter in the middle of a storm, and she was alone in a way that had no soft edges. Her children were not going to call. Raymond was not going to reconsider. No one was coming over that hill with help or resources or even the simple human acknowledgement that she was here and that it mattered. She picked up her phone. 4%. The screen showed no missed calls, no messages. She opened her photos without meaning to and found herself looking at an image from 3 Christmases ago, herself and Raymond in front of a tree she had decorated, both of them smiling with the easy confidence of people who believe the ground beneath them is permanent. She put the phone face down on the workbench. The despair that moved through her then was total, not dramatic, not loud, just complete, the way darkness is complete when the last light goes out. She felt it in every part of herself simultaneously, felt the weight of every year and every compromise and every small surrender accumulated across 28 years of building a life that had turned out to belong entirely to someone else. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm kept arriving. She didn't sleep. Not really. She drifted in and out of something that had the shape of sleep without any of its restoration, surfacing every 20 minutes into the sound of rain and the cold and the specific awareness of exactly where she was and exactly what she had been thinking before she closed her eyes. The despair was still there each time she surfaced, patient and thorough, the way only the truest things are patient and thorough. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, still dark outside, still raining, Cecelia opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling of the shelter and made herself complete the thought she had been avoiding since she arrived. Not the soft version of it, the real one. If she stayed here and nothing changed, she would not survive the winter. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, the way neglected things fail, a small injury that didn't heal, a cold that settled into her chest and stayed, a week of inadequate food and inadequate warmth that left her too depleted to recover from the next thing. The math of it was straightforward, and she was intelligent enough to do the math. So the question was not whether things needed to change, the question was whether she was the one who was going to change them. She lay there for a long time with that question, turned it over, looked at it from the angles she had been avoiding. There was a version of events in which she drove into Delridge tomorrow and called her daughter and said she needed help, said she couldn't do this, said the whole thing had been a mistake and she needed somewhere to go. That version existed. It was available to her. Her daughter would answer in that careful, rehearsed voice, and there would be a series of practical arrangements made, and Cecelia would end up in a spare room somewhere, being managed with polite efficiency by people who had already decided what her limitations were. And then what? Then she would spend whatever years remained to her as a confirmation of everyone's assessment, as evidence that Raymond had been right to calculate her worth and find it insufficient, as proof that 61 was in fact the end of something rather than the beginning. She sat up on the workbench. Her knee screamed. She ignored it. She swung her legs over the edge and put her feet on the wet floor, and felt the cold water come through her socks immediately, and ignored that too. She sat in the dark with the rain hammering the roof, and she looked across the shelter toward the wall that faced the mine entrance, and she said out loud, to no one, to the dark and the cold and the indifferent rain, the thing that had been trying to form itself in her chest for weeks, I am not finished. Her voice was rough from disuse, and it didn't sound the way she intended it to sound. It didn't sound strong or certain or cinematic. It sounded like a woman who had been lying in the cold for 2 days saying something out loud, because saying it out loud was the only way to make it real. But that was exactly what it was, and that was exactly enough. She stood up. Her knee made its objections known at considerable volume, and she adjusted her weight and stood anyway. She found her headlamp and put it on. She found the bucket she had been using to bail water and picked it up. The water on the floor was 2 inches deep along the eastern wall, and she began moving it toward the door, 1 bucket at a time, opening the door and throwing it out into the rain and coming back and filling the bucket again. It was completely pointless. The rain was still falling, and the water would be back within the hour, and she was bailing a flooded shelter in the middle of the night with an injured knee, and she did not care at all, because the act of doing something, anything, was the difference between the version of herself that called her daughter tomorrow and the version that did not. On her 6th trip to the door, she stopped. She stood in the doorway with the rain coming down outside and the beam of her headlamp catching the falling water, and she looked up the hillside toward the mine entrance, half visible through the cedar in the dark. The timber boards she had partially removed 2 weeks ago were still open. From somewhere inside, or perhaps from the stone of the hill itself, the faintest breath of mineral air reached her even through the rain. Ancient and cool and entirely unbothered by the storm. The mine had been sealed for 50 years, and the storm had not touched what was inside it. Cecelia stood in the doorway and felt something move through her that she recognized after a moment as anger, clean and hot and clarifying. The best kind of anger, the kind that doesn't consume but instead illuminates. She was still here. Her hands still worked. Her mind still functioned with every bit of the precision and creativity it had always possessed. The precision and creativity that 28 years of marriage had employed, without ever once bothering to name or acknowledge or value. Raymond had given her this land because he thought it was worthless. She was beginning to understand that he had made that calculation before, and that he had been wrong both times. She went back inside and added wood to the small stove she had built in the corner, and fed the fire back to life, and sat in front of it with her injured knee elevated and her wet socks steaming in the heat, and she began for the first time to make actual plans. The storm ended on the 3rd day. Cecelia walked outside into a silence so complete it felt like a different planet from the one the storm had been occupying. The sky washed pale and clean, the cedar trees dark with moisture, the hillside gleaming where water moved in thin sheets down the shale toward the flat ground below. Everything smelled of wet earth and cold stone, and something underneath both of those things, something mineral and deep, rising from the hill itself like breath. She stood outside for a long time before she went back in to work. The plan she had made by the fire 2 nights ago was not elegant. It had no grand vision, no completed picture she was working toward. It was a series of immediate problems ranked by urgency with practical solutions attached to each, written in the margin of the only notebook she had brought with her. Roof first, floor drainage second, heat source improvement third, water access fourth, everything else after. She had learned something in 28 years of managing a household on a budget that Raymond perpetually underestimated, that transformation was never one large decision. It was 100 small ones, made consistently, in the right order. She started with the roof. She spent 3 days on it, working methodically across the surface from the eastern seam outward, layering salvaged metal sheeting and sealing every joint with a mixture she developed through trial and error involving pine resin and fine clay, and a patience she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands bled twice from the metal edges. She kept working. By the end of the 3rd day, the roof was not perfect, but it was sealed, genuinely sealed. And when she stood inside and looked up, she felt the particular satisfaction of having solved a physical problem with her own hands, a satisfaction she had no previous vocabulary for, because she had never before been in a position that required it. The floor drainage took a week. She studied the way water moved across the concrete during the next rainfall, watched it with the focused attention she used to give to household budgets, tracing its path, identifying the low points, understanding the logic of it before she intervened. Then she chiseled a shallow channel along the eastern wall, leading to a small hole she drilled through the base of the wall, and lined the channel with flat stones she carried from the hillside one by one in a bucket, her arthritic hands gripping through the pain because the pain had become simply part of the work rather than a reason to stop.
The mine revealed itself slowly, the way trust reveals itself. Each day she went a little further inside. She had found 2 old battery lanterns in the back of the shelter, both dead, and she had driven into Delridge and spent $11 on batteries she couldn't really afford. With light, the mine became something else entirely. The walls in the first chamber were extraordinary, layered in bands of silver and gray and deep copper red, the white quartz veins catching the lantern light and scattering it across the ceiling in patterns that shifted as she moved. She would stand in there some mornings and simply look, the way you look at something that is asking you to understand it. She began improving the mine entrance the way she had improved everything else, methodically, practically, one problem at a time. She cleared the floor of decades of accumulated debris. She reinforced 2 of the old timber supports that had begun to lean. She lined the entrance passage with flat stones set into the earth, creating a surface that was solid underfoot and, though she hadn't intended this, genuinely beautiful. The different colors of the stone creating a natural mosaic that caught the afternoon light in a way that made people stop and look, though at this point the only person doing the stopping and looking was herself. By January she had running water. It had taken 2 weeks of work she never would have imagined herself capable of 4 months earlier, involving salvaged pipe sections and a natural seep she had discovered in the hillside above the mine entrance, water filtering through the stone and emerging cold and clean from a crack 12 feet up the rock face. She channeled it down with pipe and gravity and the stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible simply because she had never done it before. The day she turned the last joint and watched clean water flow steadily into the barrel she had positioned outside the shelter door, she sat down on the ground next to it and cried for the first time since she arrived. Not from sadness, from something that didn't have a clean name, but lived in the same neighborhood as pride and grief and wonder simultaneously. She was 61 years old. She had separated from the only adult life she had ever known. She was sitting in the dirt on a hillside that the entire world had written off, and she had just built herself running water. She had no idea yet that she was only beginning. Raymond came on a Thursday in late April when the hillside had turned green almost overnight, the way hill country does in spring, as though the land had been holding its breath through the cold months and finally decided to exhale all at once. The cedar trees were dark and full. Wildflowers had pushed through the shale along the eastern fence in colors Cecelia hadn't expected, pale yellow and deep violet, and a particular shade of burnt orange that appeared in the morning light like something that had been placed there deliberately. She was working at the mine entrance when she heard the car. She had spent the morning laying the final section of stone path that ran from the shelter door to the mine entrance, a 60-foot stretch of fitted flat stones she had collected and sorted and placed over the course of 3 weeks, each one chosen for its color and shape, the whole path forming a pattern that moved from pale grey at the shelter end to deep copper red at the mine entrance, following the natural color progression of the hillside stone as though the earth itself had designed it. She stood up slowly when she heard the engine, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and watched Raymond's car come down the gravel road and stop at the fence line. He got out carefully, the way people get out of cars when they are uncertain of the ground beneath them. He was wearing clothes that looked expensive and slightly wrong for the setting, the particular wrongness of a man who was dressed for a version of this visit that no longer exists. He stood at the fence and looked down the hill at what Cecelia had built, and she watched his face go through several expressions in quick succession, none of which he managed to fully control. She did not go to him. She wiped her hands on her work pants and waited while he opened the gate and walked down the stone path toward her, his eyes moving constantly, taking in the reinforced shelter with its clean roof and the window boxes she had built and planted with herbs, the water barrel with its steady trickle from the hillside above, the cleared and leveled ground, the stone path beneath his feet, and at the far end the mine entrance framed with timber she had refinished, and either side planted with whatever she had been able to grow from seeds she found in the back of the shelter and supplemented with cuttings from the hillside. He stopped 10 feet from her. "My God, Cecelia," he said. His voice had the quality of a man who had prepared something to say and found it no longer applicable. She said nothing. She waited. He looked past her at the mine entrance, at the lantern light visible inside, at the stone floor she had laid in the first chamber, at the walls with their extraordinary banding of color that she had cleaned and in places carefully chiseled to reveal more fully. He looked for a long time.
"You did all of this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Who else?" she said. He walked slowly to the mine entrance and looked inside. She watched him take in the first chamber, the lantern light moving across the copper and silver walls, the white quartz catching and scattering it, the timber supports she had reinforced and in some places replaced, the small wooden bench she had built against the left wall where she sometimes sat in the mornings with her coffee and simply existed inside the mountain. She watched his face do something complicated. He turned around. "Cecelia, I came because I wanted to see how you were managing." His voice had shifted into a register she recognized from 28 years of marriage, the register he used when he was about to reframe something in his favor. "I've been thinking about what happened, about whether things could have been handled differently." She looked at him steadily. "Go on." "I think I made some decisions too quickly." He paused, letting that sit, apparently waiting for her to fill the silence the way she had always filled silences. She didn't. "I think if we were to sit down and talk properly, without the lawyers involved, we might find that there's a version of things that works better for both of us." Cecelia looked at Raymond for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at the mine walls, patiently, without rushing to a conclusion, letting what was actually there reveal itself, rather than imposing a story on it. What she saw was a man who had traveled 40 minutes to recover something he had discarded because someone else had revealed its value. She recognized the mechanism. She had watched him apply it to properties and business arrangements and people her entire marriage. She picked up the stone she had been about to place when he arrived. She turned it in her hands, feeling its weight, its edges, the cold smoothness of it. Then she crouched down and fitted it into the path with a precision that came from weeks of practice. "I think you should go, Raymond," she said without looking up. She pressed the stone level with the heel of her hand. "I have work to do." She heard him stand there for a moment, heard the particular silence of a man recalculating. Then she heard his footsteps on the stone path going back toward the gate, and then the car door, and then the engine, and then nothing but the hillside and the wind in the cedar and the faint sound of water moving through pipe above her. She placed the next stone, then the next. The path was almost finished. Dolores arrived first, on a Friday afternoon in late May, driving a sedan with a cracked taillight and the careful, deliberate speed of a woman who has somewhere specific to be and is not entirely certain she should be going there. She was 69 years old, recently widowed, and she had heard about Cecelia the way things travel in small towns, not through any single conversation but through a kind of atmospheric accumulation, fragments passing between people at the hardware store and the diner and the Thursday farmer's market until the story had enough weight to find its way to the people who needed it most. She stood at the gate for a moment before she opened it, looking down the stone path at the shelter and the mine entrance and the hillside garden and the water feature Cecelia had built along the eastern wall, a series of shallow stone basins that stepped down the slope and caught the overflow from the pipe above, each basin clear and still and reflecting the sky in a slightly different shade depending on its depth and angle. Then she opened the gate and walked down. Cecelia was in the mine when she heard footsteps on the stone path. She came out with dirt on her hands and her headlamp still on her forehead, and found a woman she had never met standing at the entrance looking at the wall with an expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself. That particular combination of hunger and recognition that appears on the face of someone encountering something they didn't know they were looking for. They talked for 3 hours. Not about practical things, not initially, about what it felt like to have the architecture of a life removed all at once, about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who were kind but not present, helpful but not honest, supportive in all the ways that carefully avoided acknowledging the actual shape of the loss. Dolores had 3 children who called regularly and meant well and made her feel, in the particular way that well-meaning people can make you feel, profoundly unseen. She came back the following Friday. Then the Friday after that. Priscilla came in June, 54 years old and 2 months out of a marriage she had spent a decade trying to save by making herself progressively smaller. Rosalind came in July, 73, her adult children having recently begun a gentle but persistent campaign to move her into assisted living that she was resisting with the focused energy of a woman who understands that the moment she stops resisting is the moment they will be right. Georgette came in August, 60 years old, looking at Cecelia's mind the way you look at evidence. Not with wonder exactly, but with the careful attention of someone updating a belief they had held for too long. None of them came because Cecelia advertised or recruited or presented herself as someone with answers. They came because the story of a woman who had been handed nothing and built something from it traveled to the people who needed it with the accuracy of something that knows where it is going. What Cecelia taught them was not a curriculum, it was a practice, the same practice that had rebuilt her, which was simply the practice of making something with your hands every day in a place that asked nothing of you except your presence and your attention. She showed them how she had learned to read the stone, how different minerals responded to different tools, how the mine walls revealed more the longer you looked. She showed them the water system she had built and the garden and the path, and the way the first chamber of the mine caught afternoon light in late summer and held it for almost an hour before releasing it. She showed them what it looked like when someone who had been told she was finished turned out to be only beginning. One afternoon in September, Cecelia sat at the entrance of the mine with Dolores and Priscilla and Rosalind and Georgette and Tamsin, Georgette's daughter, 37 years old and in the early raw weeks of her own unraveling, and she looked at the 5 of them and felt something so complete and unexpected that it took her a moment to identify it. Not happiness, though it contained happiness, not pride, though it contained that too. Something older and quieter than either. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, surrounded by people who see you as fully and honestly as you see them. The mine breathed behind her, cool and mineral and ancient, the same breath that had reached her through the sealed timbers on that first morning when everything was still broken and nothing had been decided yet. She was 62 years old. She lived on a hillside in a place the world had written off. She had built this from nothing, from the particular nothing that is left when everything you thought defined you has been taken away, and what she had found inside that nothing was this, was exactly this. If you have ever been handed nothing and told it was more than you deserved, if you have ever stood at the edge of a life that no longer exists and been unable to see what comes next, if you have ever been assessed by someone who never once looked closely enough to see what was actually there, this story is for you. Because what Cecelia found inside that mountain was not silver or ore or anything the original miners were looking for. What she found was the thing that had been there all along, patient and quiet and completely indifferent to whether anyone ever came looking. She found that her worth had never once depended on Raymond's ability to perceive it, that her capability had always existed independent of whether anyone gave her permission to use it, that the most extraordinary transformations do not happen in the light, in front of witnesses, with encouragement and resources and a safety net firmly in place. They happen in the dark, in the cold, when you are alone and the storm is still falling and you decide for no reason except that the alternative is unacceptable, to pick up the bucket and keep going. Dreams do not age. They wait. They wait inside you with the patience of stone, with the quiet certainty of water moving through rock,
building pressure slowly and invisibly until the day you are finally broken open enough to let them through. Cecelia walked back into the mine, lantern in hand, and got back to work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.